Yo, what's going on, YouTube? And welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we are taking a look up in Montreal at the Montreal Canadiens. So, yeah, things have gone pretty much how we expected in Montreal this year. It's been a rough season for the Habs, and the expectation is they will be in the Connor Bedard sweepstakes this summer. So, what are the Habs going to do ahead of the deadline? There's a couple of guys that are on pending contracts that might have a little bit of value on the trade market, and it might be in the best interest of the Habs to maybe trade some of those guys away instead of losing them for nothing this summer. So some of those guys are available. Some of the names we're going to look at today: Jonathan Drouin, Evgenii Dadonov, Joel Edmondson, and Sean Monahan. Those are the guys we're going to look at today, and for various different reasons, we're going to look at their trade value, what they could potentially fetch on the market, what the links are in terms of what teams may or should be interested in these players, and my predictions for where I think they're going to end up. So we're going to do that today. So we're going to start off with some of the forwards. So we're going to start off with Sean Monahan. Now, Sean Monahan is an interesting case here because this is a guy that has played pretty well in his career and is a guy that, the Flames kind of traded for nothing this summer, and I think the Habs can actually get a decent return from Monahan. A lot of teams seem interested in him. The fact he's playing well this season in Montreal definitely helps things. But recently, his recent injury history has made it quite difficult. He's back on the IR currently right now. But this season, he has 17 points in 25 games with the Habs. So when he's in the lineup, he can produce, and that is something that teams are going to look at. So he's not completely a dead asset. He's only 28 years old, so it's not like there's a guy that has no potential. He's 35 years old and not worth re-signing long-term. Teams might be willing to give up a little bit more, seeing a future with Sean Monahan. He's the former 6th overall pick in the 2013 NHL draft, and currently has a 10-team no-trade list, which is a modified no-trade clause attached to his contract, and that started in the 2020-21 season. And part of that 10-team no-trade list, the Montreal Canadiens were not on that list, where he ultimately ended up getting traded to, and that still stands today if he gets traded out of Montreal. So that's what we're looking at with Sean Monahan. He is on a pending contract, so that plays into it a little bit as well and what he may fetch on the market. I think it's safe to say a first or second round pick is likely the price for Monahan. I think a first round pick is optimistic, and a team may be looking for him more than just this season. But more likely than not, again, the fact he's back on the IR, he hasn't been necessarily healthy the past couple of years in Calgary. That's a big reason they let him go. And the fact that some of that salary cap is going to have to be retained by the Habs, probably to a contending team, I think that diminishes some of the value there. But I think a first or second round pick is pretty realistic for the Habs to get in return for Monahan. Again, the numbers are there. He just has to be in the lineup, and that's part of the issue with Monahan. Some of the teams I think will be interested in Monahan this coming trade deadline this spring. The Carolina Hurricanes are a team I think that is looking to add another center or just some more depth to that group. They love to add scoring depth at the trade deadline. I don't think they'll be afraid to do that this time around either. Maybe as a guy to play on that third line. Again, you don't like giving up first and second round picks for third line centers, but they are critical in the National Hockey League. And again, when you talk about maybe going on a long playoff run, the Hurricanes, a little bit of a lack of attrition, with some of those older guys down the middle, it might be a nice thing to have Monahan there as well as just an extra guy, right? The Pittsburgh Penguins, another interesting one, kind of for the same reasons. I think these are two teams that are going to be fighting it out at the top of the Metropolitan Division this spring. And I think that the Pittsburgh Penguins would love to have that extra depth there. There could be a scenario here where the Habs can actually pick up some assets in return and maybe get closer to that first round pick. Maybe taking a Kasperi Kapanen-esque contract, they might be able to take advantage of maybe getting 2 first round picks from the Pittsburgh Penguins this year's and next's, which could be a real value for the Habs going into the summer, having that extra draft capital. Yeah, you have to take on the Kapanen contract, but you're getting a player in return for the rest of this season, as well as a guy that you could kind of see what you can, kind of a reclamation project going into next season for the Habs. So I think that's something to look at. And obviously, not to mention, they also potentially could get some really good draft assets in that deal. So I think that's something really to consider. The Pittsburgh Penguins could be a really nice fit there. Minnesota is the third team I have here. And what I like about the Minnesota Wild is they seem like a team that I really think Bill Guerin he's really avoiding trying to trade that first round pick, I think. But let's be honest, he has a ton of assets on his team already. And if maybe they decide that they don't want to go for the big asset like a Bo Horvat or a Patrick Kane or one of these bigger names that could be available, Sean Monahan could be a real intriguing option. This is a guy that might cost you just a first or second round pick. So Bill Guerin can still keep one of those 2 picks going into the draft this year. And you have to maneuver a little bit of money. And I think that the Habs would be able to work with that and maybe retaining a little bit more on the deal. But I think Sean Monahan to the Minnesota Wild could be a real asset for them going into the hopeful playoff run for the Central Division leaders right now in the Minnesota Wild. Moving on, we're going to take a look at Jonathan Drouin. Now, Drouin is kind of an interesting story. This is a guy that came in at a high price from the Tampa Bay Lightning in the price of Mikhail Sergachev. I'm sure if the Habs could have redone that trade, that's one of the famous flaws of Marc Bergevin was he liked to make big trades and make big moves. Except they didn't always pan out, and this was one of those that really was detrimental to them Montreal Canadiens at the time. I think they're hoping to get a second or third round pick for Drouin. Again, the production has been there to varying degrees for Drouin. He's had the same issues as Monahan in terms of the health, but I think teams are more optimistic at the future of Monahan than Drouin, and I think that's really the concern here when you look at a guy like Jonathan Drouin. This is a guy that's really mightily struggled, and I think that he needs a change of scenery, and unfortunately taking him out of his hometown team in the Montreal Canadiens. Now, I have 3 teams here for Jonathan Drouin that could be interested. Again, some of these teams you have to finagle the salary cap, and that's part of the reason the Habs have struggled to move Drouin. But the New York Islanders, I think, are always a contender looking to add another depth forward. Drouin could immediately jump into the top 6 for the Islanders as a guy that can immediately play on the power play. And I think that's something that the Islanders are lacking. This is a team that really struggles on the power play. Drouin could come in there and maybe make a difference. And this could be his last real shot at playing in the NHL as, kind of the idea of being a NHL player and a regular in the lineup. This is a really big opportunity. I think the Islanders are one of the few teams that could really be a fit for him. A team that could maybe make the playoffs, willing to give up the assets, has a little bit of side money to get something done here, has the available prospects and draft picks that, would be willing to give up for Drouin. There's something there. Same thing for the Buffalo Sabres. I think the Sabres want to see where they land. They're just on the outside of the playoffs currently looking in. And the Montreal Canadiens would be trading in their division, which there's always some concern with that, especially with young scoring players. You have to be careful with that. But I think they would be willing to take that risk if the return was good enough from the Sabres. The Sabres would be able to eat all of the salary the rest of the way for Drouin this season. So that makes things a little easier. It's just, is Kevin Adams and the management in Buffalo willing to start giving up some of those draft picks to maybe acquire a good forward? And again, the way they've been scoring, they're like toward the top of the NHL in scoring. So if Drouin can't score in Buffalo, he's probably not scoring anywhere. So we'll see how things go there. I think that's a really interesting fit, though. And the last team I have here is the Florida Panthers. And similar to the Buffalo Sabres, for a different reason, they've been struggling this season. And I think out of the teams that are out of the playoff race right now, that I think confidently can get themselves back into the chase, I would say is the Florida Panthers. Again, it depends on how things go here down the stretch, but I think the Florida Panthers should absolutely be a team in on Jonathan Drouin. And not to mention, he played for their their division rival, their in-state rival, the Tampa Bay Lightning, was drafted by the Lightning. They've seen him a little bit, and they know what he's about. I wonder if they're a team that could say, yeah, you know what? We want to get back at the Bolts, and we're going to bring back a former player in Jonathan Drouin back down to the Sunshine State. So I think that's something to consider, and definitely an interesting storyline to watch as we move toward the deadline. Another guy to look at here today is Evgenii Dadonov. Evgenii Dadonov is also on the final year of his deal. His deal ends July 1st of this summer. I think the prospect of him getting a good deal in terms of assets is kind of asking for a lot. I think you're looking, again, similar to Drouin, maybe a little more optimism, maybe closer to that second, third round draft pick assets. But again, you're talking about a team that's a fringe playoff team that isn't confident and ready to give up that first round pick, but is willing to give up a second or third or fourth round pick. That's what you're looking at here for Dadonov. I think a couple of teams that are maybe a little bit more veteran-led could be looking at a guy like Dadonov. I have the Dallas Stars as a team looking to add some more scoring depth. He could immediately jump into that top six, maybe even that top line, which would be really interesting if he were to find a home in Dallas. We've seen that the Stars are not afraid to bring in Russian forwards. Obviously Alexander Romanov. Not Romanov. Alex Radulov, before going back to Russia, played a pretty key role in the Dallas Stars, and the irony is Dadonov could potentially take Radulov's spot in the lineup for the Dallas Stars if they were to go down that route. The Boston Bruins are a team that, again, I think depending on where the Bruins go, whether they go with, say, a Patrick Kane or a Bo Horvat or one of those higher-end names, if they swing and miss on some of those guys, I think Dadonov could be a really nice consolation prize and a guy that could immediately add some scoring depth to the Bees going into the NHL playoffs, which is where I think the Bruins are destined. And the Calgary Flames. I think the Flames are always a team that's in on some of these sneaky, lower-level guys that can add some scoring depth. They've already taken a couple of swings with guys like Toffoli and Kadri here over the last couple of years, and I think they're going to look to continue that here at this deadline and potentially adding a guy like Dadonov. And I think the thing that I think I think the Habs would like in this deal is getting him out of the conference, similar to the Dallas Stars, right? Trading him to Boston. You don't love the idea of trading him in the division and to a rival like the Boston Bruins. But again, if the value is there, I think that Dadonov could be actually a pretty good asset for a team to acquire, and a team, might be willing to give up the assets that, the Habs don't feel like they got completely screwed last minute for a deal for Dadonov. So keep an eye on that one. Now the next one is Joel Edmondson to end today's video. And what's interesting about Joel Edmondson is he still has one more year left on his contract. So he's got 2 years left of eligibility. And I think a lot of teams will be licking their chops at that one. And funny enough, all three of these teams, if I'm Joel Edmondson, you don't have to worry about a visa, because I think he's going to end up staying in Canada. In all three of my teams, I have Joel Edmondson staying in Canada. And I think this is something that, I think it's more a sign of the teams that are just interested in where he would be a good fit, more so than the fact that it's the geographic of Canada. But I just noticed that and I thought it was kind of funny. But Joel Edmondson is a guy that honestly is probably the most valuable asset that the Montreal Canadiens have going into this year's deadline. In terms of guys they're willing to trade. Obviously, Nick Suzuki and Caulfield and some of those other guys are more valuable players, but those aren't guys they're willing to trade. I think Edmondson is the most valuable asset on the trade market that the Montreal Canadiens have to offer. What's nice about Joel Edmondson is, like I said, his contract is very, very much an attractor. He's making $3.5 million this season And next, which I think a lot of teams will say, yeah, I kind of like that guy. He's obviously a Western Canadian boy, as Don Cherry would say, a Brandon, Manitoba native. He's still in a point where he's really in the twilight of his prime. He's 29 years old, 6'5", 225 pounds. He has a modified no trade clause. He submits a 10-team no trade list. So you have to look at all of that stuff. Looking at what he's done here, you've got 3 seasons in Montreal. He's played 29 games this season. He's a -16, but again, that's playing in Montreal. He's got over 400 games in the National Hockey League, and if he stays healthy, is going to hit that 500-game mark by the end of this season, which is very impressive. This is a guy that plays penalty kill, has a really good shot, so he is a threat 5-on-5. He can have a nice hard shot from the point. And he lays big hits. And I think a lot of teams will be looking at a guy like that, especially on a playoff push, that could be interested. Now, again, I think this is a team that depends on where they sit come playoff time. You know, closer to the deadline, are the Ottawa Senators truly a playoff contender? I think the Ottawa Senators could really be a player for Joel Edmondson. They've made it quite clear to a lot of teams around the league that they want to add some depth to the blue line, and Joel Edmondson could definitely do that and kind of be a building block for some of the younger defensemen in Ottawa until some of those guys develop and are able to take Joel Edmondson's spot on the blue line. He's a really good bridge defenseman to fill out your top 6 blue line. The Edmonton Oilers, a team that struggled as of recently. And I think a team that would love to add a guy on the back end to help out some of those goaltenders there in Edmonton, and Skinner and Campbell. And to protect some of their superstars, right? The McDavids and the Draisaitl's of this team. A guy like Joel Edmondson, not afraid to drop the glove, 6'5", 224. Brandon, Manitoba native. He's from Western Canada. He could be a fan favorite very quickly with the Oilers. And the same situation with the Toronto Maple Leafs, who is the 3rd team I have on here. I think the cap hit is very attractive to the Oilers and the Leafs in particular. And the fact they have some security in his deal, they are going to be willing to trade a 1st and a 2nd round pick, I think, for Edmondson. That is how high on value I think Edmondson can be. And this is a guy that, you know, he's played his games. He's done his due diligence in the NHL. And yeah, he's not going to be scoring big goals for you and going crazy and doing all this. But this is a guy that has a good pedigree at the National Hockey League level. He can shoot. He could play left defense, right defense. So there's some utility in that sense. He could play both sides on the blue line, whichever spot you need him. He scored a big goal for the Blues in the Stanley Cup playoffs. His lone goal was that game, I think it was game 1 or game 2 overtime winner, right? Joel Edmondson got that in Boston. Huge key in their success in that Stanley Cup run in 2019. Played in Carolina and had a pretty good run with Carolina in 2020. And then obviously has kind of, been a building block and a core defenseman for the Montreal Canadiens in his 3 seasons there. So this is a guy that I think is really the guy that if you're looking at Montreal, Joel Edmondson is your top asset and is going to be a key indicator in what the Habs have potentially going into the draft this coming spring. So guys, that's it for today's video. Let me know what you guys think down below. Leave some mock trades for the Montreal Canadiens and some of the guys I mentioned today, or some guys I didn't mention. Who were some guys I didn't mention that you would like to potentially see traded? I see Michael Pezzetta's name there. I would like to see him stay in Montreal, so I didn't make a trade there, but there's definitely reason to believe that as well. Jordan Harris's, contract comes to a conclusion this year, so do they want to keep him long term? Have they seen enough where they're willing to maybe trade him? Let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching, and let's go Habs.